She rejected you, disappeared, acted cold, and then suddenly she comes back. Most men think it means she finally realized their value. But that's rarely the real reason. Female psychology is far deeper and far more emotional than most men understand. Sometimes a woman returns not because she loves you, but because your absence changed the emotional game inside her mind. The moment you stop chasing, stop explaining, and start focusing on yourself, something strange happens. The attraction she lost begins to reactivate. In this video, you'll discover the hidden psychological reasons why women come back after rejecting men, and why understanding this truth can completely change the way you see attraction forever. There is a strange moment many men experience but almost never talk about. A woman rejects them, ignores them, walks away, or makes them feel invisible. And then weeks or months later, she suddenly comes back. Maybe she sends a message out of nowhere. Maybe she starts watching every story you post. Maybe she reappears with curiosity in her voice that was never there before. And the average man immediately assumes one thing: now she finally sees my value. But human psychology is never that simple. Attraction is not a straight line. It moves in silence, uncertainty, emotional contrast, and subconscious tension far more than people realize. Most men believe rejection is always final. But in reality, many women reject men before their emotions have even had time to fully process the possibility of attraction. This happens because attraction is deeply connected to emotional timing. A woman can meet a man at a moment when her mind is distracted, emotionally unavailable, overwhelmed, or simply too comfortable to feel curiosity. And curiosity is one of the strongest emotional triggers in human connection. Without it, attraction struggles to grow. The problem is that many men destroy curiosity too early. They overexplain themselves. They seek constant reassurance. They make their feelings too obvious before emotional tension has had time to develop naturally. The human mind rarely obsesses over what feels fully available. It becomes emotionally attached to what creates unanswered thoughts. This is why absence affects people so deeply. Once you disappear, the emotional noise disappears with you, and suddenly the silence becomes noticeable. A woman who once felt nothing begins asking herself quiet questions she never asked before. Why did he stop caring? Why doesn't he chase me anymore? Did I misunderstand him? And those questions matter because the mind becomes emotionally attached to unfinished emotional experiences. Human beings are naturally disturbed by emotional incompleteness. What once felt ordinary suddenly becomes psychologically important the moment it is no longer accessible. This is where most men make a mistake. The moment a woman returns, they assume they must immediately prove themselves again. But what actually changed her perception was not begging, convincing, or chasing. It was emotional distance combined with personal transformation. There is something psychologically powerful about a man who learns to emotionally detach without becoming bitter. When a man stops needing validation to feel worthy, his entire energy changes. He speaks differently, he reacts differently, he carries himself differently. And women are highly sensitive to emotional energy, even when they cannot logically explain it. A calm man creates a completely different emotional experience than a desperate one. Desperation creates pressure. Calmness creates curiosity. Neediness feels predictable. Self-respect feels rare. And the human mind is naturally drawn toward what feels emotionally rare. What many men never realize is that attraction often grows stronger in memory than in presence. When you constantly chase someone, you give their brain no space to emotionally process your absence. But when you quietly move forward with your life, something unusual happens. Your image inside their mind begins evolving. The brain fills emotional gaps with imagination, and imagination is often stronger than reality itself. This is why some women come back after you stop caring. Not because they consciously planned it, but because your emotional withdrawal changed the psychological balance. You are no longer performing for attention. You are no longer emotionally predictable. And unpredictability creates mental focus. But there is another truth most people avoid discussing. Sometimes a woman returns not because she deeply loves you, but because your detachment challenged her emotional certainty. Human beings unconsciously seek emotional control in relationships. When someone who once chased us suddenly becomes independent, it disrupts the emotional pattern our brain expected. And disruption creates attention. A man who peacefully moves on can become emotionally unforgettable because he represents something rare: emotional self-control. Most people react emotionally after rejection. They become angry, desperate, bitter, or obsessed. But the man who accepts reality, improves himself, and quietly continues living sends a completely different psychological signal. His silence communicates strength more loudly than words ever could. And this is where the mindset shift happens. The goal should never be to make someone come back. That mindset keeps your happiness trapped inside another person's decision. Real power begins when you stop measuring your value through someone else's attention. Because the truth is, the men who become most attractive are usually the men who stopped building their identity around being chosen. When a man becomes emotionally grounded, he no longer chases love from a place of emptiness. He stops performing. He stops trying to constantly prove worth. And ironically, that is often when people begin seeing his value for the first time. Because confidence is not loud. Real confidence is emotional stability. It is the ability to lose someone without losing yourself. And that energy changes everything. Sometimes people come back because they finally recognize your value. Sometimes they come back because your absence created emotional curiosity. And sometimes they come back simply because your growth forced them to see you differently than before. But the deeper lesson is this: never become so focused on who walked away that you forget who you are becoming. There is another layer to this psychology that most men never notice until it is too late. Sometimes the woman who rejected you was never truly rejecting your value. She was rejecting the version of you that existed in that moment. Human beings are constantly reacting to energy, emotional presence, and perception. And perception changes faster than reality itself. A man who constantly seeks approval slowly teaches people to see him as emotionally dependent, not because he is weak, but because his behavior quietly says, "My confidence depends on your response." And the human mind rarely feels deep attraction towards someone who hands over their emotional power too easily. This is why many men become confused after a breakup or rejection. They think love disappeared overnight, but in reality, attraction often fades slowly through repeated emotional patterns that destroy tension, mystery, and individuality. When a woman feels that a man's entire emotional world revolves around her, something subconscious begins to shift. She stops wondering about him because she already knows exactly where he stands. There is no uncertainty left, no emotional challenge, no space for imagination, and the brain needs emotional space to create desire. This is why distance changes everything. Distance forces reflection. Silence forces the mind to think without distraction. And during that silence, people often begin remembering emotions differently than they experienced them in real time. The arguments become smaller in memory. The emotional moments become larger. Your absence slowly transforms into emotional contrast. Suddenly, the man who once felt ordinary begins feeling emotionally significant simply because he is no longer emotionally available. But here's the dangerous part. Many men misunderstand this and become cold, toxic, or emotionally manipulative, thinking it will create attraction. Real emotional strength is not pretending not to care. It is genuinely becoming okay with uncertainty. There is a massive psychological difference between a man who ignores someone to gain control and a man who peacefully focuses on his own growth because he respects himself enough to move forward. Women can often sense that difference instinctively. One energy feels forced, the other feels authentic. And authenticity is rare in modern relationships. Most people are acting, pretending, performing versions of themselves they think will be accepted. But the people who create the deepest emotional impact are usually the ones who stop trying so hard to be chosen. Think about it. The people who stay in your mind the longest are rarely the loudest ones. They are the ones who made you feel something unresolved, something unfinished, something emotionally real. That is why emotional self-control is so powerful. A man who can experience rejection without collapsing emotionally becomes psychologically different from most people. Because rejection exposes insecurity that success often hides. It reveals whether your confidence was real or simply dependent on external validation. And many men unknowingly build their identity around female approval. The compliments, attention, and affection become emotional fuel. So when rejection happens, they do not just lose a person, they lose their sense of worth. But the men who truly evolve after rejection begin understanding something deeper. They realize attraction cannot be forced. No amount of convincing can make someone emotionally ready for you. And the moment you stop trying to control other people's feelings is the moment you regain control over your own life. Ironically, this emotional independence is what often makes someone attractive again. Because people are naturally drawn toward those who seem emotionally complete within themselves. Not arrogant, not emotionless, just grounded, peaceful, centered. And when a woman sees that the man she once rejected no longer seeks her validation, it creates a psychological interruption in her mind. The emotional dynamic changes completely. Now she becomes the one observing, wondering, thinking, questioning. Why is he different now? Why does his energy feel calmer? Why do I suddenly notice him more? Most attraction begins with emotional perception, not logic. And perception changes when energy changes. But even then, a man must be careful. Not everyone who comes back deserves access to your life again. Sometimes people return because they are lonely. Sometimes because they miss attention. Sometimes because they are curious whether they still have emotional influence over you. This is why emotional maturity matters more than emotional excitement. A strong mindset is not about making people regret losing you. It is about becoming someone who no longer needs revenge, validation, or emotional games to feel valuable. Because at the end of the day, the greatest transformation is not when someone comes back. It is when you finally realize you were always enough without them. Most men spend years trying to understand women, without ever understanding the emotional patterns inside themselves first. And that is why rejection hurts them so deeply. It is not always the loss of the woman that breaks them. It is the destruction of the future they imagined in their mind. Human beings become emotionally attached to possibilities long before reality actually happens. A man can create an entire emotional connection inside his imagination while the relationship itself is still uncertain. And when rejection comes, the pain feels personal because the brain experiences the collapse of expectation like the loss of something real. But this is where life quietly teaches one of its deepest lessons. Rejection has a strange way of revealing the parts of you that were emotionally asleep. Some men become obsessed after rejection because they confuse emotional attachment with love. Real love does not destroy your identity. Real love does not make you abandon your peace, your dignity, or your self-respect just to keep someone interested. But insecurity does. Insecurity whispers dangerous thoughts into the mind. Maybe if I try harder, maybe if I change myself, maybe if I sacrifice more, they will finally choose me. And without realizing it, many men slowly begin negotiating away pieces of their personality just to avoid abandonment. This is why emotionally unavailable relationships become addictive. The human brain becomes attached to inconsistency because inconsistency creates emotional highs and lows. One moment you feel wanted, the next moment you feel ignored. And that emotional instability keeps the brain trapped in anticipation, constantly searching for the next moment of validation. It becomes less about connection and more about emotional survival. But eventually, something changes inside a man who grows through pain instead of running from it. He begins noticing patterns. He notices how chasing someone often pushes them further away. He notices how emotional desperation clouds judgment. He notices how people sometimes respect the version of him that finally stopped begging for attention. And this realization can feel almost cruel because it forces him to confront an uncomfortable truth. Many people do not value what is constantly available to them. That truth changes the way he moves through life. He becomes quieter but not weaker, more observant, less reactive. He stops trying to force emotional outcomes. He stops needing immediate reassurance. And for the first time, his confidence begins growing from within instead of from external approval. This is the stage where many women suddenly begin noticing him differently. Not because he became someone fake, but because he finally stopped abandoning himself emotionally. There is something deeply magnetic about a man who is emotionally at peace with uncertainty, a man who can care deeply without losing control of himself, a man who no longer treats rejection like proof of worthlessness. Because the truth is, rejection often says more about timing, emotional readiness, and compatibility than personal value. But emotionally immature minds personalize everything. They think, if someone leaves me, I must not be enough. And that belief becomes dangerous because it creates lifelong emotional hunger, the need to constantly prove worth, constantly impress, constantly seek validation from people who may never even understand your value properly in the first place. That is why the deepest mindset shift happens when a man realizes attraction is not something he needs to chase endlessly. Attraction is often a byproduct of emotional alignment, self-respect, and inner stability. People feel your relationship with yourself long before they fully connect with your words. And women especially notice emotional congruence. They notice when a man's confidence is genuine versus performed. They notice when his kindness comes from strength instead of fear of losing them. They notice when he has a life, purpose, and emotional identity beyond relationships. That energy is impossible to fake for long, because eventually every mask breaks under pressure. And maybe that is why so many women come back later. Not because the man became richer, more attractive, or more successful alone, but because pain forced him to emotionally mature. Rejection forced him to stop depending on external love to feel internally complete. Suddenly, he is no longer trying to win people. He is simply being himself without fear. And fearlessness changes perception. People can feel when someone is no longer emotionally chasing outcomes. There is a calmness in their presence, a freedom, a grounded energy that quietly says, I know my worth even if you do not. Ironically, that is the energy many men were searching for through relationships all along. But real confidence was never hidden inside another person's acceptance. It was built the moment they stopped abandoning themselves to be loved. There comes a point in a man's life where he slowly realizes that attraction is not really about looks, money, or perfect words alone. Those things may create attention, but attention and emotional attachment are not the same thing. Real attachment forms in the invisible space between emotions, memories, uncertainty, and psychological impact. And most people never understand this until they lose someone they thought would stay forever. One of the deepest truths about human nature is that people often realize emotional value through absence, not presence. While someone is constantly available, constantly giving, constantly chasing, the emotional mind adapts to that energy and begins treating it as normal. This is how appreciation quietly dies, not through hatred, but through emotional familiarity. The human brain is designed to notice change more than consistency. That is why silence can feel louder than words. That is why losing someone emotionally stable can suddenly create a void that no amount of distractions can fully replace. And this is exactly what happens when a man finally stops chasing. At first, the woman may feel relief, freedom, or emotional distance. But over time, something unexpected begins happening inside her subconscious mind. The emotional patterns connected to him do not disappear instantly. In fact, the mind often replays emotional memories more intensely after separation because memory removes everyday imperfections and focuses on emotional impact instead. Suddenly, she remembers his calmness, his attention, his presence, the way he listened, the way he cared without asking for anything in return. And now those memories feel different because they are no longer easily accessible. Human beings naturally place higher emotional value on what feels scarce. Scarcity creates psychological weight, and emotional scarcity is one of the strongest forces in attraction. But this is where the story becomes deeper than relationships. Because the real transformation is not about making someone miss you, it is about what happens to you when you finally stop needing to be chosen to feel worthy. Most men spend years unconsciously tying their self-worth to women's reactions. If she texts back, they feel valuable. If she loses interest, they feel invisible. Their emotional state becomes controlled by external behavior they cannot even control. That is emotional dependency. And emotional dependency destroys inner peace, because no human being can provide permanent emotional certainty. People change. Feelings shift. Life moves unpredictably. If your identity depends entirely on another person's attention, your confidence will always remain fragile. This is why rejection can either destroy a man or awaken him. Some men become bitter after heartbreak. They blame women, become emotionally cold, and start hiding pain behind arrogance. But other men choose a different path. They use rejection as a mirror. They begin confronting the insecurities they spent years avoiding. They build discipline, emotional control, self-respect, purpose, and slowly they stop seeking relationships as emotional rescue. That shift changes everything, because women are deeply sensitive to emotional grounding. A man who is emotionally centered feels different to be around. He is not trying to impress everyone. He is not desperately seeking approval. He is present, calm, certain of himself without needing constant validation. And that emotional stability creates a feeling of safety and mystery at the same time. Very few men understand how powerful that combination truly is. Safety creates trust. Mystery creates curiosity. And curiosity is often the beginning of emotional attraction. This is why many women return after rejecting a man who genuinely evolved. Not because he manipulated them, not because he played games, but because his energy became psychologically different. pain forced him to grow into someone more emotionally complete. And growth changes presence. People can feel when someone has suffered deeply and survived it without losing themselves. There is a quiet strength in that kind of person. They no longer react impulsively. They no longer panic over rejection. They understand that losing one person does not mean losing their value. That realization creates freedom. And freedom is attractive because it removes emotional pressure from human interaction. The strongest people are often the ones who can love deeply while still remaining emotionally independent. They care without controlling. They connect without losing themselves. They accept uncertainty without collapsing emotionally. Most people never reach that level because they spend their entire lives trying to avoid pain instead of learning from it. But pain, when understood correctly, becomes transformation. It strips away illusion. It exposes insecurity. It forces self-reflection. And eventually, it teaches a man the most important lesson of all. The moment you stop chasing validation, you finally become free. There is something almost tragic about the way human beings search for love. Most people are not truly searching for connection. They are searching for emotional confirmation. They want someone to look at them and silently say, "You are enough." And because of that, many relationships are built not on genuine emotional alignment, but on the desperate hope that another person can heal insecurities that were never healed within. This is why rejection feels so much heavier than it appears on the surface. A woman rejecting a man is rarely just about her leaving. For many men, it awakens old fears they have carried quietly for years. The fear of not being good enough, not attractive enough, not successful enough, not worthy enough to be fully chosen. And once those fears are triggered, the mind begins creating dangerous emotional stories that slowly destroy confidence from the inside. She found someone better. I was never enough. I lost my only chance. And the mind believes these thoughts because emotional pain distorts perception. Pain narrows reality. It makes temporary emotions feel permanent. But what most men never realize is that rejection often has less to do with absolute value and more to do with emotional alignment, timing, and subconscious perception. Human attraction is deeply emotional before it is logical. People feel energy long before they analyze compatibility. They react to confidence, emotional presence, certainty, emotional freedom, and even emotional tension without consciously understanding why. This is why two men can say the exact same words to a woman and create completely different emotional reactions. The words matter less than the emotional state behind them. And emotional state cannot be faked forever. A man who secretly fears abandonment behaves differently without realizing it. He overthinks messages. He reacts too quickly. He seeks reassurance constantly. He becomes emotionally attached before trust is even built. And while his intentions may be sincere, the emotional pressure underneath his behavior slowly weakens attraction. Because attraction grows best in emotional freedom, not emotional pressure. This is one of the hardest truths men must understand. The more desperately you need someone to stay, the more emotionally heavy your presence becomes. And emotional heaviness exhausts people over time. But when a man genuinely values himself beyond relationships, his energy changes naturally. He stops forcing conversations, stops trying to constantly impress, stops panicking over silence, and suddenly his presence feels lighter, calmer, stronger. Women notice this shift immediately, not always consciously, but emotionally. Because people are deeply affected by how someone makes them feel emotionally, not just by what they say. A grounded man creates emotional comfort. An insecure man creates emotional tension. And over time, emotional tension pushes people away, no matter how attractive, intelligent, or successful someone appears on the surface. This is why some women come back after rejecting a man who transformed emotionally. They sense the difference. The old emotional dependency is gone. The neediness disappeared. The man who once chased validation now feels emotionally centered within himself. And that creates curiosity. Curiosity is powerful because the human brain is naturally drawn toward emotional uncertainty. When someone becomes difficult to emotionally predict, the mind begins focusing on them more intensely. This is why absence can create obsession, while constant availability creates emotional numbness. But the deepest lesson is not about making someone obsessed with you. It is about understanding yourself deeply enough that rejection no longer destroys your identity. Because emotionally mature people understand something that emotionally dependent people do not. Not everyone who leaves is meant to stay, and not every rejection is a loss. Sometimes rejection is life forcing you to stop shrinking yourself for temporary emotional approval. Think about how many men abandon their real personality just to keep someone interested. They suppress opinions, hide emotions, pretend to be endlessly agreeable, constantly adapt themselves to avoid losing connection. And slowly, without noticing, they become strangers to themselves. That is the real danger, not heartbreak, self abandonment. Because once a man disconnects from his own identity in order to be loved, he enters every relationship from a position of fear instead of authenticity. And fear always creates emotional instability. But pain has a strange ability to wake people up. A man who grows through rejection eventually becomes more emotionally aware. He learns patience, emotional control, self respect. He realizes that chasing people rarely creates genuine love. And he finally understands that the strongest relationships are built between two emotionally complete people, not two emotionally starving people trying to rescue each other. That understanding changes his entire presence. Now he no longer seeks love to escape loneliness. He seeks connection from a place of peace. And peace changes everything.